Chapter 1. The chain hit the floor before I could breathe. 700 people watched it fall. 700 people who had eaten food I coordinated delivery for, who had evacuated through routes I designed at 3 in the morning with smoke in my lungs and a radio pressed against my ear. 700 people who said nothing. Rhett Calloway stood at the ceremonial podium inside the Rainier Crown Royal Lodge, and his voice carried the easy authority of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved to be believed. Cedar and burnt sugar filled the air around him. My body recognized that scent before my mind could shut the response down. For years of memory lived inside that smell. For years of ranger cabins and late-night arguments, and a man who once told me that choosing me was the only decision he had ever made without political calculation. He announced Dawson Weller's name like it was a solution. He announced the Sierra Dominion Alliance like it was salvation. He removed my silver promise chain like it was a clerical correction. Dawson stood beside him in ceremonial white, and the smile that crossed his face arrived before the chain had finished its fall. It was the particular kind of smile that belongs to people who have been rehearsing for a moment they were promised long before it was publicly announced. I noticed, in that exact second, that the silver clasp at Dawson's throat was mine. Not similar to mine. Mine. The one Rhett had given me during our second winter together. The one I had placed inside his private cabinet when I stayed at the lodge for 3 months coordinating the Cascade evacuation. Someone had gone into that cabinet before today. The copper afternoon light pushed through the lodge windows and caught every face in the hall. Council members, agricultural leaders, PAC representatives from Oregon, Idaho, Montana, people whose children I had carried through smoke, people whose names I knew and whose emergencies I had answered at hours when Rhett was still asleep. Not one of them met my eyes. Rhett stepped toward me privately after the ceremony, away from the crowd, in the narrow corridor outside the summit hall. He offered me an estate in eastern Washington, permanent monthly allowance, an advisory title with no command authority and no seat at any operational table. I looked at him for a long time. "You have placed this kingdom's throat inside another alpha's hand," I told him, "and called it a rescue." He said the decision had already been made. I told him I was aware of that. I told him I had been aware of it before I entered the room, because the watershed code on Gideon Weller's drought projection map was 18 months outdated, and no legitimate environmental consultant working in good faith would have submitted data that old to justify a permanent territorial alliance. Rhett's jaw tightened. He said that was not my concern anymore. I said nothing after that. There was nothing useful left to say to a man who had just publicly defined the limits of what he believed I was worth, and then offered me a cage decorated to look like a gift. I walked back through the hall. I retrieved one thing from the summit room, a copy of the environmental data packet that Gideon's team had distributed to council members, folded it into my jacket, and left through the east exit without looking at the podium or the man still standing beside it. The copper sky outside had turned darker. Wildfire smoke from the eastern ridgeline was moving west faster than the morning projection had estimated. I noticed that too. I noticed it because noticing things like that was what I did. It was what I had always done. It was, apparently, something Rhett Calloway believed he could afford to permanently discard along with the chain now lying somewhere on a ceremonial floor. I reached my vehicle. I pulled out my emergency device to check the eastern fire line, and the screen showed a single encrypted message from a number I did not recognize. 4 words. "Do not take the Western Highway." Then 2 more. "Gideon's men." I sat completely still for 3 seconds. Then I looked in the rearview mirror at the Royal Lodge growing smaller behind me. Then I looked at the Western Highway entrance 40 meters ahead. 2 black vehicles sat parked at its edge with their engines running. They had been there when I arrived that morning. They were still there now. Chapter 2. I took the Forest Service Road. Gravel cracked under my tires in the dark, and the tree line on both sides pressed close enough that branches dragged across the windows like fingers. My headlights carved maybe 30 feet of visibility ahead, and I drove on memory, on 4 years of emergency route planning in this territory, on the specific knowledge that the logging spur past mile marker 11 connected to a state access road that Gideon Weller's private security would not have bothered to map. My emergency device showed the Western Highway behind me. Both black vehicles had pulled onto it within minutes of my departure. They were not following the forest road. That meant either they did not know which route I had taken, or they had already placed someone ahead. I chose to believe neither and drove faster. The bond broke at the Rainier boundary. I did not expect it to happen the way it did. The promised chain was gone, but the biological thread that 4 years of proximity and shared scent and two people choosing each other repeatedly had woven between us, that was still present when I crossed the territorial marker. And then it was not. It snapped somewhere inside my chest with a physical violence that pulled my hands off the wheel and sent the vehicle sliding toward the drainage ditch on the road's left shoulder. I got it stopped. I sat on the frozen logging road with the engine running and both hands pressed flat against my sternum, breathing through the sensation the way I had once taught evacuation volunteers to breathe through smoke inhalation. Controlled, measured, one function at a time. Rhett's cedar scent was gone from the air around me. Completely gone, as though it had never existed. As though 4 years of a man's presence had been a climate that ended the moment I crossed an invisible line. I almost called him. My finger found the contact before my mind caught up to what I was doing, and I sat there in the dark with my thumb hovering over his name and the broken bond still radiating outward through my ribcage like something structural had been removed. I thought about the chain hitting the floor. I thought about Dawson's smile arriving before the sound of impact. I thought about 700 people who said nothing. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and started driving again. 15 minutes later, headlights appeared behind me. Not one vehicle. 3. They came fast, without the hesitation of someone unfamiliar with the road, which meant they had been waiting somewhere along the specific route. My encrypted warning had given me a head start, not a safe path. Someone had anticipated that I would avoid the Western Highway and positioned a second team accordingly. I ran the terrain in my head. The old Whitmore Service Bridge was 3 miles ahead. Single lane. Wooden planking over a 40-foot canyon drop. It had been flagged for structural review in last spring's infrastructure assessment, the same assessment I had submitted to Rhett's council, and which the council had tabled because Gideon's alliance proposal arrived the same week and consumed every available administrative priority. I knew exactly how much weight that bridge could hold. I knew it because I had written the original inspection protocol. I pressed the accelerator down and reached the bridge in 4 minutes. I crossed it fast, felt the planking shift under my rear tires in a way that confirmed the structural concern from my report, and pulled hard onto the access road on the far side. Then I grabbed the emergency flares from my kit and ran back to the bridge on foot. I placed 2 flares at the near approach and 1 beneath the center support beam. The first pursuing vehicle hit the approach doing roughly 60 miles an hour. The driver saw the flares and braked. The braking sent the rear end into the guardrail. The vehicle stopped halfway across the bridge with the planking groaning under its weight. The second and third vehicles stopped behind it. I was already moving through the tree line on foot, heading northeast toward the state access road, when I heard a single gunshot from somewhere behind the stopped vehicles. Not aimed at me, aimed at the lead vehicle's rear tire. Someone was disabling the pursuit from inside their own convoy. I stopped walking, turned, stared back through the trees at the frozen tableau of 3 vehicles and men moving in confusion around them. Someone in that group had just helped me escape. I did not know who. I ran. Chapter 3. Seattle received me like it receives everyone who arrives broken, without ceremony, without recognition, and with exactly enough indifference to make survival feel like a personal achievement. I had 1 bag. Inside it, 3 days of clothing, my emergency medical bracelet with its encrypted storage, 17 pages of printed environmental data from Gideon Weller's drought projection packet, and a secondary suppressant kit that had already begun losing thermal stability because the chase through the forest had cost me the insulated case I left in my vehicle. The bond rupture had done something to my biochemistry that the suppressants were struggling to compensate for. I understood the mechanics. An unfinished bond, severed at the territorial boundary rather than dissolved through proper medical protocol, leaves the omegas scent glands in a state of acute biological confusion. My body was still producing markers designed to reach Rhett Calloway. In Seattle, surrounded by strangers, those markers were broadcasting distress into air that contained no one capable of responding. I rented desk space inside an abandoned office above a closed Korean grocery store in the International District. The owner accepted 2 weeks of cash and did not ask my name. I slept on the floor for the first 4 nights using my jacket as a pillow and the environmental data spread across the desk above me like a sky of evidence I could not yet use. My first presentation took place 11 days after I left Rainier Crown. I had built the Emergency Communications Network concept over 3 years of operational testing inside Rhett's territory. I had documentation. I had performance metrics. I had a working prototype of the dispatch coordination software running on 2 second-hand laptops. The investor group occupied a glass conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown Seattle tower. 5 people. For alphas, 1 beta. They let me speak for 7 minutes before the first one interrupted to ask whether I had PAC sponsorship. I said I operated independently. The room changed temperature. The second interruption came at minute 9, when one of the alphas asked directly whether an unbonded Omega had successfully commanded alpha field contractors during an active emergency. I said yes. I named 3 specific wildfires, their dates, the number of lives involved, and the response times my coordination had achieved against state agency benchmarks. He wrote nothing down. The meeting ended at 12 minutes. A different company called me 4 days later and offered to purchase my software designs outright for a number that would have paid my rent for 6 months. They did not offer employment. They did not offer credit. They offered to buy what I had built and place someone else's name on it. I declined and hung up. That night, my suppressants failed entirely for approximately 4 hours. I lay on the office floor with my temperature spiking and Rhett Calloway's name moving through my thoughts like a current I could not interrupt. I pressed my hand against my mouth at some point. Later, I discovered I had bitten into the base of my thumb hard enough to bruise. When the fever broke near dawn, I sat up and looked at the data spread across my desk. The watershed code in Gideon's projection map was dated to a federal assessment period that had been superseded by updated regional modeling 18 months before the Rainier Summit. Any legitimate environmental consultant would have used the current model. The current model showed no critical drought threshold for Rainier Crown's primary reservoir catchment area. Gideon had not rescued Rainier Crown from an environmental crisis. He had constructed the appearance of one. I was still processing the weight of that when my device received an anonymous file transfer at 4:47 in the morning. No sender identification, encrypted through a routing protocol I recognized as military adjacent. Inside the file, 7 additional pages of reservoir management data, a predicted communications failure window for the Olympic Peninsula's coastal PAC settlements, and a timestamp. The predicted failure was scheduled to begin in 11 days. I cross-referenced the coastal settlements. 3 of them had no existing emergency infrastructure contracts. 2 of them had populations with high proportions of unbonded Omegas and elderly PAC members. All 3 sat in a coverage gap that no state agency or PAC government had formally claimed responsibility for. I looked at the anonymous file for a long time. Then I called Colby Shaw, the beta venture investor who had rejected my original proposal, and told him I needed 1 night to demonstrate a live operational system. He said the concept was interesting but unproven. I told him it would be proven in 11 days. He said he would be watching. Exactly 11 days later, the communications network along Washington's Olympic Peninsula failed at the precise hour the anonymous file had predicted. Chapter 4. The storm hit the Olympic Peninsula at 11:14 in the evening, and it did not arrive gently. I was already running the operation from the unfinished office when the first communications tower went down, exactly as the anonymous file had predicted. Wind readings from the northern settlement exceeded recorded coastal benchmarks. My second-hand laptops were running the dispatch software, and every data feed I had was lighting up simultaneously, which is the specific condition that sorts the people who plan from the people who trained. I had planned, and I had trained, and the first drone I deployed into that wine corridor lasted approximately 4 minutes before the stabilization system lost its argument with the weather and the feed went dark. I sat with that for 3 seconds. Then I rerouted. I pulled every volunteer driver contact I had spent the last 3 weeks quietly building. Fishing vessel operators working the pre-storm hours. A retired PAC medic living 20 miles from the most isolated settlement. A beta radio technician who had worked coastal emergency services for 12 years and whose name appeared in a regional emergency response archive I had accessed through a state public records request. The critical problem was the clinic on the northern edge of the second settlement. Elderly population. Backup generator rated for 6 hours. The storm forecast showed 14 hours of severe conditions minimum. I assigned the fishing vessels to the medical supply run and rerouted the road teams to the clinic. Then a volunteer alpha named Derek, who had accepted my coordination instructions for the first 40 minutes of the operation, stopped responding to channel commands and took his 2-vehicle unit toward the southern settlement instead. apparently having decided that his read of the situation superseded mine. I did not argue with him over the radio. I logged his vehicle's last known position, confirmed the southern settlement had lower immediate medical risk, and redistributed his assigned routes across the remaining teams. 17 minutes later, Derek's unit hit a flooded access road that my routing system had flagged and avoided. His vehicle stopped. He called back in asking for an alternate. I gave him one. He followed it without comment. The clinic received its generator fuel at hour 5. The medical team reached the northern settlement at hour 7 using a combination of the fishing vessel route and a trail path the retired medic knew from 30 years of working that coastline. The communications relay I improvised from 2 portable units and the radio technician's equipment restored emergency channel access to all 3 settlements by hour 9. By morning, every isolated community was stable. Colby Shaw called me at 7:22 a.m. He did not open with congratulations. He opened with a question about my liability framework, which told me he had already decided to invest and was moving into due diligence. We met that afternoon in a coffee shop 2 blocks from my office. He ordered black coffee and asked me 11 specific operational questions and did not interrupt my answers. At the end of it, he said he wanted to see a 5-year projection. I told him I had brought it. I named the company Emberline Response Systems that same week. I named it that because every time I had worked in active fire, I had noticed that the tree line where burned forest met living forest was where the most important decisions got made. Survival did not happen at the safe center. It happened at the edge. Emberline's first contract covered emergency communications for 3 coastal PAC settlements. The second came from a rural hospital that had lost state agency support after a jurisdictional boundary reclassification. The third came from a renewable energy cooperative trying to maintain microgrid stability across 4 unprotected Omega majority communities in eastern Oregon. Within the first month, I had a real office. Within 3 months, I had 12 employees. Within 6 months, I had my first state emergency certification, which was the credential that allowed Emberline to operate inside confidential supernatural community jurisdictions under the Intercommunity Emergency Compact. But inside the anonymous data file, buried beneath the Coastal Communications Failure Prediction, I found something I had not examined carefully until the week after the Olympic Peninsula rescue. A subsidiary structure chart. 6 wildfire insurance companies operating across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, each with separate registrations, separate public leadership names, and separate operational addresses. The parent funding behind all 6 traced to one source, Gideon Weller. Gideon did not just control water. He controlled the insurance infrastructure that determined which PAC territories could afford wildfire protection and which ones could not, which meant he controlled something more valuable than a reservoir. He controlled which territories survived disaster and which ones didn't. Then my new office server flagged an unauthorized access attempt. The intrusion signature matched Rainier Crown's administrative network. Someone inside Rhett's kingdom was watching me build. Chapter 5. 2 years passed the way survival always passes. Not gently, not quickly, but with the specific weight of a person who has stopped waiting to feel normal and started building something instead. Emberline operated emergency communications, wildfire certification, medical transport, and renewable microgrids across 6 western states. My name appeared in confidential regulatory filings and nowhere else. The company had a public-facing director, a beta named Reese Calder, who had approached me after our second state certification hearing and offered his legal expertise in exchange for a role I eventually realized he had already decided to commit to regardless of the title. Reese was the kind of attorney who treated supernatural infrastructure law as a moral project. He suited the work. I owned 43% of the emergency communications infrastructure serving hidden supernatural communities between the Canadian border and the California state line. I had not been on a date since I left Rainier Crown. I want to be precise about that because the absence was not accidental and it was not monastic discipline. It was the specific emotional condition of a person who had handed their full biological trust to another person and received a public ceremony of discarding in return. My wolf had recognized Rhett Calloway across a gymnasium full of smoke-stained families on the worst day that county had seen in a generation. That kind of recognition does not simply redirect. It waits or it goes quiet, and mine had gone very quiet. What I knew about Rainier Crown I learned from regulatory filings, anonymous data drops, and one source inside the territory I had not yet confirmed. The Alliance had not saved it. Gideon Weller had delivered reservoir access on a schedule that kept Rainier Crown's farms producing just enough to prevent open revolt while requiring RET to approve each new infrastructure concession as a condition of the water release. The arrangement had the architecture of generosity and the mechanics of a slow conversion of ownership. Pack farms were producing 60% of their pre-alliance yield. Wildfire crews had lost 3 vehicles to equipment failures that a properly funded maintenance budget would have caught. 2 rural Omegas had died during a heating grid failure that my original emergency network specification had identified as a critical vulnerability in its risk assessment, a document that RET's council had voted to defer during the week of Gideon's arrival. I read those medical reports 3 times. The first time I felt something close to vindication. The second time I felt sick. The third time I understood that whatever I had believed I was building over the past 2 years, which I had privately narrated to myself as a focused professional project with political consequences, was actually something more morally complicated. Real people were suffering inside a territory whose collapse I had sometimes permitted myself to imagine with a satisfaction I was not proud of. If Rainier Crown failed completely, RET would face consequences. Thousands of people who had no vote in what happened to my promise chain would face them too. RET had tried to contact me. I learned this not from him but from a Rainier Crown administrative record request that Reese filed as part of a regional emergency compact review. The request surfaced a deleted inquiry through the state's Supernatural Resident Registry, a search for a Miles Arden, filed approximately 8 months after I left, from an account registered to the Rainier Crown Royal Office. He had searched for me through the one official channel he had access to. I had been registered under my mother's surname since week 2 in Seattle. He would have found nothing. I sat with that information for one evening and then I filed it in the part of my mind where I kept things that were true and useless simultaneously. What I could not file away was the regulatory report that landed in Reese's office on a Thursday afternoon in October. Rainier Crown had failed its second emergency compact infrastructure inspection. Deficiencies in communications coverage, medical transport response times, and microgrid redundancy. A third failure would trigger the emergency compact's receiver provision. Under that provision, a certified emergency operator could petition the state to assume temporary stewardship of a failing territory's critical infrastructure. The provision had existed inside the compact since its original drafting. I had read the compact dozens of times in the context of Emberline's certification process. I had never registered what that specific clause meant until Reese set the report on my desk and said very carefully that he thought I should read page 47. The anonymous source requested an in-person meeting that same night. I drove to the parking garage coordinates alone. Dawson Weller was standing beside a concrete pillar in the 3rd sublevel, wearing civilian clothes and no-pack insignia, and the first words out of his mouth were not an apology. "I destroyed your first investor meeting because my father ordered it," he said. "Now I need your help to destroy him." Chapter 6. Dawson Weller did not look like a man who had everything. He looked like a man who had learned to perform having everything so convincingly that even he had forgotten what the performance was covering. Standing in that parking garage under flat concrete light, without his ceremonial silver and without his father's guards positioned 6 feet behind him, he looked exactly like what he was. An Omega who had been handed to a king by a man who viewed both of them as transaction items. I did not feel sorry for him. I felt the specific alertness of a person who recognizes that the most dangerous information sometimes arrives from the most compromised source. He told me everything without me asking a single question, which told me he had been rehearsing this conversation for a long time. He had arranged the sabotage of my first investor presentation by feeding Gideon's contact inside that conference room a fabricated report suggesting my emergency software had caused a coordination failure during a real fire. The report was false. The contact had distributed it to 3 of the 5 investors before I arrived. The room had already decided before I opened my mouth. He told me this without breaking eye contact, which took more courage than I credited him for in that moment. Then he told me something I had not known. The photograph taken outside the Ranger cabin during my second winter with Rhett, the one I had noticed a brief flash from and assumed was a press drone, had been taken by a man Gideon employed specifically to build leverage files on territorial Alpha Kings whose land he intended to acquire. Gideon had possessed documented evidence of my relationship with Rhett for 3 years before the summit ceremony. He had not used it as blackmail. He had used it as a timeline. He waited until Rainier Crown's drought anxiety reached its peak, then presented his reservoir alliance as the only available solution, knowing Rhett would sacrifice the relationship to secure his people. Gideon had not reacted to the relationship. He had planned around it. Rhett had not been manipulated into a random political choice. He had been walked, step by deliberate step, into a room with one visible door, and Gideon had built every wall. I stood with that information inside my chest and felt it rearrange something. Not forgiveness. Understanding is not the same thing as forgiveness, and I was careful to keep that distinction clear in real time because the alternative was losing the objectivity I needed for what came next. Reese verified Dawson's documents over the following 72 hours. 6 wildfire insurance subsidiaries with shared parent funding. Falsified drought projections submitted to 3 separate state regulatory bodies. Bribed infrastructure inspectors across 2 counties. Shell company contracts designed to convert public utility failures into Gideon's private holdings. And 1 additional document that Reese set on my desk without comment, waiting for me to read it before he said anything. It was a memo from Gideon's security chief, dated 4 days after I crossed the Rainier boundary. The subject line read, "Arden retrieval. Terminate if retrieval fails." I had known someone tried to kill me on that logging road. I had not known it was a written operational order. Reese said, very quietly, that Gideon had been afraid of what I knew from the moment I left. I went to see Hollis Boone the next morning. He was 81 years old and lived in a 2-story house 40 minutes outside Seattle with a garden that suggested he had been spending his retirement doing the one thing Gideon's operation could not purchase, which was patience. I expected denial. I expected the rehearsed composure of a man protecting a decision he had made for complicated reasons he believed were defensible. Instead, Hollis opened his front door, looked at me for 3 full seconds, and said he had been wondering how long it would take me to find the amendment. He walked me to his study and placed a document on the desk. Original Emergency Compact Charter. Page 47, Clause 9, Subsection 4. The architect of any failing territory's foundational emergency network, if certified under the compact, retained eligible stewardship rights upon a 3rd infrastructure inspection failure. Hollis had written that clause himself during the original drafting. He had inserted it into the alliance agreement that Gideon's lawyers had reviewed and approved without catching it. He had signed Gideon's paperwork with a weapon buried inside it. I could not stop Rhett from choosing wrong, Hollis said. I could only make sure the door stayed unlocked for the person who would eventually come back to fix it. Then every screen in my phone lit up simultaneously. Rainier Crown's power grid had just gone offline. The final inspection was in 72 hours. Chapter 7. The wildfire ignition reports came in at 4 separate locations simultaneously, which is not how fires start naturally. 4 simultaneous ignitions along the Cascade foothills meant 4 separate points of origin, which meant accelerant, which meant the storm system moving through the region had not caused this. Someone had used the storm as timing. I was running the Emberline Command Center on Elliott Bay's 48th floor when Rainier Crown's emergency radio network began broadcasting false evacuation routes. I caught it because the coordinates in the broadcast directed civilians toward a box canyon with 1 entrance and 0 exits. I knew that canyon. I had flagged it as a critical avoidance zone in the original Rainier emergency network specification I wrote during my first year with Rhett. Whoever had programmed the false broadcast had access to the old network architecture, and they had embedded Emberline's certification signature inside the sabotage software. The frame was clean. If civilians followed those routes and died, every piece of digital evidence would show Emberline's credentials authorizing the misdirection. My company, my certification number, my name attached to a mass casualty event during a state emergency inspection. I pulled my team off the automated systems and went fully manual. Every route update pushed by human voice over verified channels. Every field unit confirmed by direct radio contact with a named Emberline coordinator. It was slower. It was the only way to guarantee the information civilians received was not being intercepted and altered. Rhett called Emberline's operations line at 11:47 p.m. Not my personal line. The operations line, which meant he still did not know I was the director. His voice came through the main channel, and I heard it hit the room like a physical pressure change. Several of my staff turned to look at me. I kept my eyes on the evacuation map. He said Emberline's credentials were attached to false routing orders that were redirecting his people into danger. He said he needed confirmation of whether Emberline was an ally or the source of the problem. His voice had the controlled edge of a man who was genuinely afraid and refusing to perform calm at the expense of accuracy. I took the radio. I gave him verifiable coordinates for the corrected routes. Heat map data from our aerial sensors. Real-time fire progression numbers pulled from 3 independent monitoring stations. I gave him enough specific operational detail that a competent Alpha King would recognize immediately that the person on the other end of the radio was not guessing. He went quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said he was trusting the routing. He said it like it cost him something. His crews moved. Dawson made his move at 12:30 a.m. He broadcast from inside the Rainier Crown Royal Communications Room, reading from the documents he had photographed over 18 months of strategic positioning beside his father at operational meetings. Reservoir manipulation schedules. False projection submission dates. Inspector payment records. His voice was steady in a way I had not expected, and I understood in that moment that Dawson had been many things, but he was not weak. Gideon's guards reached the communications room at 12:44 a.m. Dawson's transmission cut off mid-sentence. I kept running the evacuation. There was a trapped medical transport at the southern edge of the second fire line. 6 patients, 2 crew members, 1 vehicle with a failed axle on a road that my rerouting had not cleared fast enough. I authorized my field supervisor to take a direct route that crossed into Rainier Crown's restricted interior. Then the upper reservoir alert came through. Gideon had opened the gates remotely. Millions of gallons of water moving toward the valley where I had directed the civilian evacuation away from the fire. Fire behind them, water ahead. I had approximately 19 minutes. I pulled the Cascade terrain files I had maintained since my first year of emergency planning in this region. There was one option. A service tunnel beneath the Rainier Crown Hydroelectric Station, running under the valley floor and emerging on the eastern ridge above the floodline. Unfinished. Unmapped in any public record. I knew it existed because I had personally walked it during an infrastructure assessment 3 years ago and written a report recommending its completion. The tunnel's internal gate could only be opened from the Royal Command Chamber. I got Rhett on the radio. I told him the valley would flood in 19 minutes and there was one exit. I gave him the coordinates of the command chamber. I told him the mechanism he would need to operate. Then I told him what operating it would permanently destroy. The radio was silent for 11 seconds. Rhett said, "Tell me exactly which panel." Chapter 8. The gate opened. I heard it through the operations channel, a low structural groan that the acoustic sensors at the tunnel entrance picked up and transmitted as a frequency shift in the background audio. One sound. And then my field coordinator's voice confirming that the eastern tunnel passage was clear and the first civilian units were moving through. Rhett had destroyed the ancestral control seal. He had surrendered the mechanism that gave the Rainier Crown Alpha King exclusive authority over the territory's hydroelectric infrastructure, the single operational power that no treaty, no inspection, and no external operator could override without the Crown's voluntary relinquishment. It had existed for 60 years. It had been the architectural centerpiece of every alliance negotiation Rainier Crown had conducted in my lifetime. He broke it without negotiating a condition. I kept directing the evacuation. The floodwater reached the valley floor 7 minutes after the last civilian unit entered the tunnel. The fire line crossed the ridge road 2 minutes after that. By the time both events completed their convergence, every person who had been in that valley was on the eastern ridge, above both, watching the landscape below them change permanently. The medical transport was still trapped. The axle failure had positioned it at a road junction that neither the tunnel route nor the ridge exit could reach within the remaining window. 2 crew members. 6 patients. I had moved every available unit to the main evacuation and had nothing left at the right position. I went myself. I want to be precise about the decision because it was not heroic in the way that word usually gets used. It was a calculation. I was the person with the exact terrain knowledge required, I had a vehicle with the right clearance rating, and the alternative was leaving 8 people on a road that was going to be inaccessible within 20 minutes. The calculation resolved in one direction. I reached the transport in 11 minutes. Rhett was already there. He had come from the command chamber through a different access route, following the same calculation I had, and arrived 4 minutes before me. He had gotten 2 patients onto a secondary vehicle and was working on the transport door when my headlights found him. He turned. The firelight from the ridge was orange and moving, and it caught the lines of his face in a way that my body registered before my operational mind could intercede. He saw me. Neither of us spoke for the length of time it took both of us to confirm that the other was real and standing and physically present on a road that neither of us should have survived the last 6 hours to reach. Then he turned back to the transport door because there were still people inside it who needed to leave. We worked the door together, got it open, moved the remaining patients to my vehicle. He took the 2 already loaded. We drove the ridge access road in separate vehicles, close enough that I could see his brake lights ahead of me, far enough that nothing about the situation permitted the conversation that the silence between us kept trying to become. At the top of the ridge, when everyone was transferred to Emberline medical units and the immediate crisis had a perimeter around it, Rhett walked to where I was standing at the ridge edge and stopped 3 feet away from me. The smoke had turned the sky the same copper color it had been at the summit ceremony. He reached up slowly and touched my face. One hand, careful. The exact weight and placement of the first time he had ever touched me with intention, in a ranger cabin, in a different life, when he was asking without words whether I would let him close the remaining distance. The bond mark beneath my collarbone went warm. Not the ache of rupture I had lived with for 2 years. Something else. Something that remembered. I stepped back. The evacuation still needs sign-off, I said. And your territory just failed its final inspection. His hand dropped. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he understands that an acknowledgement is the only thing he has earned the right to offer. Dawson's partial transmission had reached a federal response coordinator before Gideon's guards cut the feed. Federal investigators were already moving on the Sierra Dominion's Washington holdings. Gideon had fled with the primary financial ledger. Rainier Crown's inspection failure was filed with state regulators at 6:14 a.m. Emberline's stewardship petition was filed at 6:15. And at 6:47, Rhett received a formal summons to appear at Emberline's Seattle headquarters to meet the anonymous emergency receiver who now controlled his territory. He still did not know my name was on the building. Chapter 9. He arrived alone. No crown insignia. No pack guards. One gray jacket and the kind of stillness that belongs to a man who has stopped performing authority because the performance no longer has an audience willing to confirm it. Underground security checked his identification twice. His guards were denied entry at the lobby level without discussion. He accepted both without protest, which told me more about what the last 24 hours had cost him than anything he could have said. I watched him move through the building on the internal monitor feed. He stopped at the 3rd floor, where the original Tacoma evacuation map hung behind glass in a hallway display. The map I had drafted in a gymnasium during the worst wildfire that county had recorded. The map that had been the first material proof that the emergency network concept worked outside of theory. I had framed it not as a trophy but as a reminder that the methodology preceded the company and the company preceded everything Gideon had tried to destroy. Rhett stood in front of it for 45 seconds. I know because I counted. Reese met him at the elevator and brought him to the 48th floor without telling him anything he had not already been told in the summons. When the office doors opened, Rhett walked in with his shoulders set and his jaw level, prepared to face a stranger with operational control of his territory and presumably a list of conditions attached to it. The chair was facing the window. Elliott Bay was silver and flat in the morning light. I let the silence run for 10 full seconds after the doors closed behind him. Not performance. I needed those 10 seconds to confirm that the version of me sitting in that chair was the version built from 2 years of floor sleeping and drone crashes and suppressant fevers and dead ends and one coastal rescue and thousands of decisions made without anyone's approval or protection. Not the version who had stood in ceremonial white while a chain hit the floor. I turned the chair. Rhett's alpha command hit the room the moment he saw my face. It was involuntary, the biological response of a dominant wolf encountering a completely unexpected shock. The pressure of it moved through the air like a change in altitude. I did not lower my eyes. The old promise chain was gone from my throat. It had been melted and reformed into a silver ring on my right hand. I had done that myself 2 months after leaving Rainier Crown, on a night when I needed to convert something that had been done to me into something I had chosen. Rhett said my name. Just my name. The way a person says a word when they have been prevented from saying it for so long that the act of saying it is its own complete sentence. I told him the state order was on the desk. I told him Emberline's stewardship covered emergency communications, energy infrastructure, medical transport, and wildfire response across Rainier Crown's full territory. I told him the emergency compact gave me temporary authority to suspend his crown's operational powers pending a recovery plan review. He said I had built all of this to take his kingdom. I showed him the casualty reports from the heating grid failure. I showed him the falsified drought projections side by side with the accurate modeling. I showed him Gideon's insurance subsidiary structure and the inspector payment records and the operational memo with my name in the subject line under the word terminate. Then I laid out the terms. Full abdication. Rainier Crown's utilities converted to community-controlled structures with independent omega and beta representation on the governing council. Dawson to receive protective witness status in exchange for complete testimony. Rhett to remain in the territory as a private citizen, subject to the same legal framework as every other resident. He looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at me. I loved what you built, he said quietly. I just didn't understand that what you built was yourself. I said nothing because there was nothing to say to that which would not have cost me the composure I needed to finish what I had started. He reached for the pen. Every screen in the building activated at once. Gideon's face appeared live, broadcasting from a location I did not immediately recognize. His voice was unhurried. He said that every emergency order and criminal charge would be withdrawn within the hour, or he would open the secondary reservoir above the eastern settlement where 1,400 people were still in post-evacuation staging. The settlement where Emberline had just moved them to safety. I looked at Reese. Reese said, "Tell him to play the recording." Chapter 10. I pressed play. Dawson's voice filled every speaker in the building, clean and time-stamped and recorded 3 weeks before this morning. During a meeting inside the Sierra Dominion's Portland operations office that Dawson had entered wearing a device the size of a shirt button, Gideon's own voice followed his son's. Unhurried, precise, the voice of a man who believed he was speaking inside a room that would never repeat what it heard. He described the drought projection falsification and named the consulting firm he had paid to produce it. He described the inspector payment schedule and referenced the account numbers by memory. He described the reservoir sabotage plan in operational terms, including the specific gate mechanism and the remote access protocol his security chief had installed. He described the order to eliminate me on the logging road as a resource protection decision. He described his plan to transfer Rainier Crown's hydroelectric assets to a Sierra Dominion holding company within 90 days of the final inspection failure, at which point Rhett's abdication would have been engineered rather than chosen. Then he said the thing that changed the weight of everything Rhett had believed about the summit ceremony. He said Dawson had never been part of the long-term plan. He said both Rhett and Dawson were temporary instruments. The alliance was a transfer mechanism. Once the assets moved, Gideon had intended to dissolve the mating arrangement on legal grounds he had already prepared, leaving Dawson without status and Rhett without territory or recourse. He had manufactured a crisis, sold a king the solution, and planned to discard everyone involved once the transaction completed. The recording ran for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. On the live feed, Gideon's expression did not collapse dramatically. It changed the way a very controlled person's expression changes when they understand that the ground under their specific position has been removed and there is no adjacent ground to step onto. His own security officers, 2 of them visible in the background of his broadcast, stepped away from him. Federal investigators had been on location since Dawson's partial transmission the night before. They moved within 90 seconds of the recording's completion. Gideon was in federal custody before his broadcast feed cut out. Rhett signed the abdication documents without being asked again. He did not perform the signing. He did not make a statement. He read every page, signed each one in the correct location, and set the pen down with the specific care of a person who understands that the action is permanent and has chosen it anyway. Dawson testified for 6 hours. He accepted responsibility for the sabotage of my investor presentation and cooperated fully with investigators on every element of Gideon's operation. He received protective status and a reduced accountability agreement that did not erase consequences but acknowledged the conditions under which his choices had been made. He was not a hero. He was a person who had made damaging decisions and then made a different one. That distinction mattered to me even when sympathy did not come easily. Rainier Crown became a governed territory. Emberline installed independent systems. The Community Council held its first session 6 weeks later with Omega and Beta representatives occupying seats that had not existed in the territory's governance structure before that morning. I did not take a crown. I did not want one. I wanted institutions that did not depend on one person's character or one alpha's choices to determine whether thousands of people had power and water and emergency response when the next fire came. I built those. Months later, I drove to the first emergency shelter Rhett and I had designed together. A low building on the eastern ridge with a backup generator and a communications array and enough supply storage for 72 hours of independent operation. A standard Tuesday inspection on my quarterly review schedule. Rhett was repairing a section of exterior wall cladding when I arrived. He worked for Emberline as a field ranger on a standard contractor agreement. He attended the required leadership training. He filed his reports on time. He had not once asked me for a private meeting or sent a message that was not operationally relevant. He came down from the ladder when he saw my vehicle. He said he was sorry. Not the speech version. Not the version designed to produce a specific response. Just the 2 words, stated plainly, with his hands at his sides and no follow-up condition attached to them. I told him his next assignment was wildfire perimeter monitoring on the northern ridge through the end of fire season. He said he understood. I walked back to my vehicle. The silver ring on my right hand went warm against my skin. Underneath my collarbone, the bond mark that 2 years of distance had faded to almost nothing pulsed once, quietly, like something deciding whether to wake up. I did not turn around. Some things are not given back by time. They are rebuilt slowly by 2 people who finally understand what they are building and why it matters. Rhett had learned what leadership cost when no one was watching and nothing was promised in return. I had learned that power is only worth holding if you use it to protect the people a different kind of power forgot. The bond would have to wait for my decision. And for the first time in 2 years, I was not afraid of what that decision might eventually become. If the story moved something in you, if it made you feel seen or lit something up inside your chest, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Every story on this channel is built to remind you that being underestimated is just the beginning of the most powerful chapter of your life. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which moment hit hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.